A never-ending news cycle continues to pour out of Gaza, and while we're coming upon the 2-year mark since October 7th and the beginning of the war in Gaza, peace seems to keep slipping just out of reach of two hands that won't stop pointing fingers at each other. So how is it a piece of land 140 square miles in size can cause such devastating clashes 80 years later? Some people might say the answer begins all the way back in 2nd millennia BC. Others say 1947, and some might even say 1917. But does that even matter? When we go back and take a glimpse into the past, we have to ask the question none of the people deciding this conflict ever will. Is it even possible for Arabs and Israelis to reconcile this history? Or is it time to wipe the slate clean and make the pragmatic decisions necessary to stop the bloodshed? Decisions that will require concessions from both sides. Now let's take a moment to terribly oversimplify the last 100 or some odd years of Jewish-Arab relations. Following the Balfour Declaration in 1917, the 1920s were a significant time for Jewish migration to the British Palestinian Mandate during what is known as the Fourth Aliyah, Aliyah being Hebrew for ascent, containing historical meaning in going up from Egypt, as well as metaphysical meaning going to a higher place. This demographic and economic change led to the formation of multiple Arab anti-Zionist and anti-British militias, such as the Black Hand, who are known for raiding Jewish settlements and sabotaging British-constructed rail lines. Tensions continued to rise and culminated in the Arab Revolt from 1936 to 1939, forcing the British to issue the White Paper in 1939, initially limiting and later halting Jewish migration to the Mandate. And while many Arab leaders wanted the immediate cessation of Jewish immigration, Zionist leaders obviously did not like limits to expanding Jewish influence, leading to a bombing campaign from the Zionist militant group the Irgun, and the creation of the Lehi, another militant group created by the exiled member of the Irgun, Abraham Stern, who later assassinated the British Minister of State, Lord Moyne. Arabs and Jews continued trading blows over the next few years, but as more and more Jewish migrants arrived, especially in the aftermath of the Holocaust, Jewish power was growing in the British Mandate. This progress gave Jewish leadership confidence that in the case of a collapse of British authorities, they would be in a good position to either negotiate good terms for a Jewish state or wield their official military arm, the Haganah, to create it themselves. They had interest in speeding up that process and also to retaliate to British operations against illegal Jewish arms smuggling into the Mandate. So in 1946, the Irgun bombed the King David Hotel in Jerusalem, the central office of the British Mandatory Authority and the headquarters of British armed forces in the region. When European powers decided to withdraw from the region in 1947 and released the UN Partition Plan, Jewish leaders took the opportunity immediately, but Arab leaders' opinions ranged from not believing the terms of the plan were fair to denying a Jewish state in the region out of principle. Inevitably, this led to the 1947 Civil War and subsequent Arab-Israeli War in 1948, resulting in what people know today as the Nakba, or catastrophe, and the displacement of 750,000 Arab Palestinians. Over the next 20 years, the territories of the West Bank and Gaza Strip were governed by the Jordanians and Egyptians, respectively, and with quite the iron fist. Clashes starting with the Suez Crisis in 1956, and then the Six-Day War in 1967 left the territories in the hands of Israel. And such begins the debate of the Israeli government's handling of the territories and people, and the Arab Palestinians' actions towards its governing authority and Jews more broadly. Not a decade has gone by where Israel hasn't seen peace, but up until more recent times, those threats tended to come from outside its borders. The Yom Kippur War in 1973 saw a coalition of Arab states led by Egypt and Syria in an attempt to reclaim the Sinai Peninsula and Golan Heights, which Israel took control of during the Six-Day War in 1967. While unsuccessful in this goal during the war, it did lead to the Camp David Accord in 1978, in which Egyptian President Anwar Sadat and Israeli Prime Minister Menachem Begin signed a peace treaty which returned the Sinai Peninsula to the Egyptians and normalized relations between the hostile nations. However, that was only one front of the conflict. In 1982, Israel launched its second invasion into Lebanon after a series of attacks by Palestinian Liberation Organization operatives in southern Lebanon. Ultimately, the destabilization of the Christian Maronite government led to the emigration of 850,000 Lebanese Christians, opening the door for the much greater influence of the Syrian government in Lebanese affairs, and the rise of Hezbollah. After this, and the slow normalization of relations with one of its other neighbors, Jordan, Israeli conflicts turned from fighting invading armies to containing non-state extremist groups on their borders and counterterrorism operations within the Palestinian territories and Israel itself. Not that it hadn't faced threats and attacks from Arab groups the entire time. Fatah, the main party of the Palestinian Liberation Organization under Yasser Arafat, and now Palestinian Authority under Mahmoud Abbas, originated in 1959 and was involved with groups like Black September, who carried out the 1972 Munich massacre. The Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine and Democratic Front for the Liberation of Palestine were created in the late 60s after the Six-Day War. Well, Palestinian Islamic Jihad began in 1981 and Hamas in 1987 during the First Intifada, just to name a few. The 90s and early 2000s saw a major uptick in violence and terrorism in the Palestinian territories with the First and Second Intifadas. While multiple attempts at peace deals occurred, namely the Madrid Conference, both Oslo Accords, and the Wye River Memorandum, none had major effects on the actual reduction of violence. Partially due to the fact that PLO leader Yasser Arafat was notorious for disavowing violence publicly while greenlighting Hamas and PIJ attacks behind the scenes. After Arafat's death in 2004, Mahmoud Abbas stepped in as the leader of Fatah and the PA. But while he may have been more serious in the relationship between the PA and Israeli government, the election of Hamas in the Gaza Strip in 2006 lost him much of his influence and control over militant groups in Gaza, who have continually launched rockets and artillery into Israel since. Hence why Israel has launched operations Summer Rains in 2006, Cast Lead in 2008, Pillar of Defense in 2012, Protective Edge in 2014, Guardian of the Well in 2021, and now its current offensive in the wake of October 7th, 2023. These are solely in Gaza. Other offensive mainly against Hezbollah in Lebanon include Operations Accountability in 1993 and Grapes of Wrath in 1996, as well as the Israel-Hezbollah War in 2006 and countless other border clashes. There's certainly no sign of an end here either, since in its 2009 manifesto, Hezbollah recommitted to the destruction of Israel, and they continue to launch attacks even after their benefactor in Bashar al-Assad was ousted. And that is the point of this video. These groups, responsible for much of the violence in Israel, the Palestinian territories, and surrounding countries, only have one goal in mind: the complete destruction of Israel, for which no sacrifice is too great. But there is another group with the say in the matter, one that has the polar opposite goal: the Israeli annexation of Palestinian territories and the removal of Palestinian Arabs. That would be members of the Knesset, specifically members of the Likud Party. Yes, especially in the aftermath of October 7th, numerous Israeli officials have espoused rhetoric directly for or referring to total destruction and resettlement of Gaza. And many Israelis agree. But it's also not just Israelis when you have the President of the United States calling for the clearing out of Gaza for a new Western business Riviera or Gaza Lago. How do they expect people of Gaza to react to that? Clearly, if you were paying any attention to this video up to this point, the Palestinian people are not just going to accept that and go quietly. So where does that put us? We're now at a point where 60,000 Palestinians have been killed since the Israeli offensive in Gaza, a people, or at least leadership, who don't seem to be in a rush to surrender to the terms offered by the Israeli government, namely the release of all hostages and disbanding of Hamas. An Israeli leading party who seems more resolved to make life so crushing and difficult for Palestinians that they have no choice but to leave. An Israeli population more resolved than ever to allow these actions in effort to destroy militant organizations, and a Palestinian population more resolved than ever to resist. This isn't a condemnation of any people involved, really. I, unlike some commentators, am perfectly willing to admit that I can understand why parties involved make the decisions that they do. I can understand why an Israeli father, whose wife and kids were part of the 1,200 killed on October 7th, would want to turn Gaza into a parking lot. And I can understand why the Gazan father, whose entire family was killed in an airstrike, would commit his life to the death of Israel. Well, that doesn't mean I agree or condone the action whatsoever. I can't say that they're illogical, only irrational to the bigger picture and extremely unproductive, to say the least. But that is the flaw of humanity. We're not perfectly pragmatic robots, and we can fall easily into a tit-for-tat cycle of violent revenge. Let's look more specifically at why groups like Hamas, Palestinian Islamic Jihad, PFLP, DFLP, etc., why do they do what they do? At the end of the day, like I said, they all have one goal: the destruction of the State of Israel and the reclamation of Palestine as an Arab territory. And while Hamas revised its charter in 2017 to remove this ultimatum and add the acceptance of a sovereign Palestinian state next to Israel, they added stipulations like rejecting any alternative to the full and complete liberation of Palestine from the river to the sea, and the establishment of a fully sovereign and independent Palestinian state with Jerusalem as its capital. So they may no longer say they want Israel completely gone, but they made stipulations that basically imply it has to happen to get what they want. PIJ and the PFLP are both solely committed to a one Arab state solution and refuse to participate in any political action, while the DFLP is a member of the PLO and the first faction to support a two-state solution. I have absolutely no doubt there are people living in Gaza and the West Bank that want nothing more than to live a peaceful life. But most voices on the issue seem to think one of two things has to be true. One is that there are fewer of these people than we all like to think. The democratic election of Hamas in the first place, the lack of significant protests since, and the support for the actions committed on October 7th could be possible evidence of this. But there are also polls conducted as the war in Gaza have gone on that have shed some possible doubt on this, at least in terms of Hamas leadership. However, these polls don't answer the question of whether Palestinians don't like Hamas for their underlying ideology or just for poor leadership and the destruction their actions have brought to Gaza. So let me just ask you, how long do you think a group like Hamas needs to be in power in order to essentially propagandize an entire generation? I'd say probably about 18 years, and they've been in power for 19. Israel has also given them so much ammunition to the point where they probably don't even need to do anything. The other option is that the violent minority has such a stranglehold over the rest that there are no opportunities for peaceful people to separate themselves from the extremists. There are certainly historical examples of this happening, but again, polls show the plurality of Palestinians believe this conflict will be solved through armed struggle. But could there be a third option? One where people turn to those they think will fight the hardest for them, no matter the underlying ideology? Or one where people turn to the last resort in desperation and loss of hope? Or one that forces people to believe that violence is the only way? That's a big question. The entire idea of a two-state solution relies on the basis that if Arab Palestinians were granted a sovereign state, much of their hostility towards Israel, or at least much of their violent hostility, would vanish. It would have to, or else the two-state solution would immediately fall apart. That's on one side of the fence. For Netanyahu and the Israeli government, as previously shown, many members of the Likud Party would love nothing more than the expansion of Israeli territory into the Palestinian territories. Minus the Arabs, of course. So extending the conflict and extending the suffering only makes it more likely for Palestinians to make concessions, or just make life so unbearable that they have to leave. Even for more moderate politicians, the options are limited. Most Israelis believe that a Palestinian state will be nothing more than a hotbed for terrorism and a place to freely launch attacks into Israel. Not to mention the fact that many Israelis and pro-Israel voices say that giving Palestinians a state would just be rewarding acts of terrorism like October 7th. And absorbing the territories with the current populations would throw off the demographics of the country and put both future demographics and political representation into greater question. Jewish Israelis will not risk becoming a minority in their own state, so absorbing over 5 million Arabs in Gaza and the West Bank is not an acceptable option. And while I'm certainly not a fan of any nation dictating policy based on an ethno-state, based on history I can't totally blame them, but I don't think using past trauma as a basis for modern policy is ultimately productive, and certainly isn't an excuse for actions taken outside of the Israeli border. These two sides are waging war of ideology. It's not a battle that can simply be solved by simple geographic concessions. Like David Ben-Gurion, the first prime minister of Israel, said, "There is a gulf, and nothing can breach it. We, as a nation, want this country to be ours. The Arabs, as a nation, want this country to be theirs." Many Arab Palestinians want a sovereign Palestine from the river to the sea, devoid of a Jewish state, and many Israelis want an expansive state of Israel, reminiscent of Old Testament parameters.
It doesn't exist.
All of Israel is our land.
All of Israel is yours.
Yeah.
Did the Green Line used to exist?
No, never.
No? You don't recognize the Green Line. There is no Green Line.
God gave us Israel, all of it.
These are not compatible, nor pragmatic, and so long as ideology reigns supreme, peace is an impossibility. Even among Westerners, pro-Israel opinions will say giving Palestinians a state will be nothing but a launchpad for attacks on Israel, while pro-Palestinian opinions will say Palestine will never be free until the oppressive imperialist state of Israel is gone. For some of you, this might be the end of the video. The history and analysis of these incompatible goals is over. Now I get to tell you what I would do if I was king of the world, or really just president, since he could probably do most of this anyway. If I could decide what the Israeli government, Palestinian Authority, and powerful nations were going to do to solve this conflict. There have to be concessions from both sides and involvement from abroad, and while in today's geopolitical environment makes for a difficult implementation of the plan, it's really not that complicated. First, the establishment of 1967 borders, or Green Line, or something very similar. Israel must remove all settlers from what would be Palestine. Now, there may be a few border settlements that I could consider allowing Israelis to keep, making small adjustments to the border with a land concession elsewhere, but for the most part, all settlers would be repatriated to Israel proper. Or another new idea, the Golan Heights. Yes, that's right. I would give the Golan Heights to Israel as incentive to repatriate West Bank settlers. With the chaos in Syria after the fall of Assad, I'm honestly not that concerned about that deal.
I'll make that deal. How about you, Yudovich? You make that deal?
I'd make that deal.
I don't blame you. Damn good deal.
For what Palestinians would have to do, it's pretty easy. Unify under a democratic Palestinian Authority, even if they want to disband the current one and create a new one. Stop attacking Israel and focus on building their new country. There would have to be a limit to the remigration of the diaspora, to say 250,000 per year or so. More so to ensure that the housing and economic markets can scale with the changes in population and not become overwhelmed. It's not very complicated, I'd say. Before getting into how these terms are maintained, there is one issue that has plagued peace talks since they began: Jerusalem. Under my plan, Jerusalem would become an international holy site under the governance and responsibility of an international coalition led by the US. Some of you might remember an idea similar to this as part of the Peel Commission in 1938. Neither the Israelis nor Arabs have ever given ground on the issue of Jerusalem, so if the kids can't get along, neither of them get it. A massive obstacle to peace immediately taken out of the equation. And guess what we could put there? I think this would be a great place to move the UN. More reason for Israel and Palestine to maintain peace, beef up security at the holy sites, and get ambassadors' useless butts out of their comfortable seats in New York so maybe they actually do something meaningful. Yes, just like the rest of Palestinian territory, Israelis would have to move out of the area, but it really isn't a big area, so relatively few Israeli families would be affected, and this housing would be needed to house members of the UN and International Security Coalition. So how will this agreement be enforced? Well, the first requirement is for Western nations to grow a pair, take the reins, and commit to peace. Then we can use this influence to actually impose punishments for infringements. Israel has the more complicated actions to implement in the plan, but it is the more organized, integrated, and prosperous nation. So for impositions on the new Palestinian state, whether economic or militarily, harsh sanctions would be imposed. Yes, I am saying to hold sanctions over the head of Israel in this plan. Strong sanctions. Just because someone is your friend does not mean you change the standard for them. Now, while I said the actions taken by Arab Palestinians in this deal are relatively small, their punishments would, objectively, be much greater. Because let's be real, most of the violent clashes have stemmed from that side of the fence, even if I might agree that some of the retaliatory actions may have been disproportional. I'll be totally honest, I have much greater confidence in broad compliance from Israel than Palestine, which is why I put a harsh penalty and oversight on them. This being that any coordinated attack on Israel or neighboring country will result in the immediate revocation of statehood and the loss of territory. Since the fall of the Ottoman Empire, Arab Palestinians have been seeking a sovereign nation. Now they would have it, but what happens when one sovereign nation attacks another? That's now a legitimate act of war, and the attacked nation now has every right to counterattack. So if the new Palestinian state attacked Israel or Jordan or Egypt, and that country wanted to counterattack via full-scale invasion, there's nothing I can really do, and there's nothing I would do. On top of this, and in order to help the new government, I would have an overseeing group of nations monitor the new Palestinian government for 5 to 10 years. Likely the G7 nations, as well as Arab nations like Egypt, UAE, Saudi, and Jordan to balance the scales. This oversight committee would not have any administrative control, but would be able to peek into the operations of the Palestinian government to ensure that they're doing what's best for their people and not encouraging extremism. As mentioned before, Jerusalem would become an international holy site governed by the US-led coalition, and this would be great for a few reasons. One is that the control of Jerusalem has been a major sticking point between Jews and Muslims since the British withdrew. This removes that hurdle and would promote compliance to the plan. Another is that bringing the UN is a great international relations opportunity to bring many people and countries together for a common cause: the protection of the holiest place for almost 4 billion people. There are 4 gates into the Old City, so it makes sense to have 2 in Israel and 2 in Palestine. In order to get in on the Israeli side, you must show either an Israeli ID or a valid visa, and the same thing on the Palestinian side, an ID or a valid visa. This would be shown upon entry only really to ensure that you have it, because in order to exit back into either country, you need that valid ID or visa. This may sound tedious, but I'm confident that with the number of countries that would be willing to send security support, I don't think there would be any sort of line to get in. Besides, checking IDs is less important upon entry and really only matters upon exiting, so people aren't using Jerusalem as a cut-through to sneak into one nation or the other. Also, for one quick housekeeping matter, how would I unify Gaza and the West Bank? Using funds surrounding Arab nations have offered for the rebuilding of Gaza to build a covered highway from Gaza City to, say, Beit Awa. It's about 30 miles, and redirecting a few Israeli roads over or under the covered highway would be easier than building a highway as an overpass or a tunnel. Some critics of these ideas are most likely coming from one of 2 camps: isolationism and anti-imperialism. There's a growing sentiment for isolationism in today's America, and I can understand why, especially in the wake of our wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. Why should we involve ourselves in conflict that isn't directly affecting Americans? Why should we potentially put US troops in harm's way? I used to be much more against the idea of America as the world's police, but then I realized that every conflict the United States and our allies ignore or stand by for kind of turned to shit and result in an exorbitant number of casualties that were completely avoidable. I believe that both as the global hegemon and hopefully the moral example, the US has an obligation to promote humanity and punish those who do not. And I think if there's one conflict that service members would find worthy of the risk, it's one with the sole purpose of preventing violence, death, and destruction towards innocent people. I would say this is a cause that many sign up for in the first place. And again, this would be the defense of a small area, with the possibility of a larger action striking down attacks only if the Israelis or Palestinians resort to violence. Anti-imperialists would say that trying to impose control or influence over these people would be an act of oppression and strip people of their right to self-determination. But some places and cultures in this world don't have a good recent track record of peace, human rights, and tolerance. Now, I'm certainly not a nation builder. I have seen how that goes, and I don't really care what these countries do within their own borders. But if preventing large-scale violence between nations, mass death of innocent people, and forcing diplomatic relations makes me an oppressor, then I'll be the greatest oppressor the world has ever seen. This power I would be using is solely to stop fighting and force peace and diplomacy. I'm not trying to control Israelis or Palestinians within their own borders, only to put them in a position where they can stop worrying about being attacked by each other, and focus on the betterment of their nations. This is, I believe, the only truly possible way for this conflict not to end in the annihilation of one group or the other. I would love to be wrong and see Arabs and Israelis put their individual interests to the side and do what is best for humanity. But I have 3,000 years worth of reasons to believe that that just won't happen. It's time for the West to step up and act like the leaders we should be. Please leave a comment on what you think, whether it's criticisms or agreements to my ideas or to the conflict itself. If you enjoyed the video, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.